Hello.
Hi.
And welcome to the podcast. On this episode, we're talking to a new friend of ours, Ty Hanson, and his StoryWorld, Millennium Exile.
So, Millennium Exile is an anime project that Ty's been working on for the past 12 years. It takes place on the world of Reiner and follows main character Vincent, who has amazing strength and powers that he doesn't quite understand until a man named
Zero,
right? A man named Zero comes out and basically beats the crap out of him and tells him that you don't know what you are. And we really got to dive into the whole lore of this world of Reiner and the whole universe of what was going on that leading up to modern times.
Yeah, right.
And Vincent's story.
Yeah, and it's really fun to dive deep. He has thousands of years of lore. And a lot of it, he's still playing with a lot of how things got to where they are. That's, the creative process, which makes it really exciting when you have these little, like, oh, this happens and then this happens there, but we don't quite know how they got to each other.
Right. Well, for example, like the different worlds that all these other beings are born on. We know of two, but it's a universe.
Yeah, right.
We have to assume that the Celestials who were playing scientists were experimenting on more than just two worlds at a time.
Very true.
So it's an absolute great conversation. We got into character development, world development, and really got to dive into Millennium Exile as a story world and where it could go. And we're really excited to see where it's going to go from here.
Right.
If you're watching this on YouTube, it's coming right up. Or if you want to listen to it, it's available on all platforms you could possibly think of. So enjoy the show.
Enjoy.
All right, great. Well, we said that we were gonna be drinking, and we are drinking, of course. So. What is this called again?
Frank called this a Frosty Knuckler.
Okay.
It's rum, pineapple juice with coconut and a little bit of orange juice and some lemon juice that I think might be bad, but it's a little.
So, if we got to take a break halfway through, you know why?
Well, I think it's just a little bitter, more bitter than it should be. I wanted it a little fresher, but the lime juice is old. But anyway, I mean, it's drinkable.
Yeah, right.
Only just G Fuel for me.
Good.
So, there you go. Well, you better keep a clear mind for this podcast. It's going to go on a bunch of different random turns. We need a designated driver, essentially, is what we're saying.
That's it.
Oh, man. All right, great. Well, we're in conversation with Ty Hanson. Ty, we usually get started with you telling us a little bit about yourself and then about the project that we're going to be talking about.
Well, first, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to meet you guys. I'm Ty Hanson. I'm just a average, everyday Australian who's trying to make his own anime. So when I started this project, it really wasn't the thing to do, and it was not just highly discouraged, but it wasn't really something that was really understood. I started this project about 12 years ago, and the landscape of anime and animation in general was very different than the one we're seeing now today. And I've been very, very lucky that there's been people before me that have walked through the door in those last 12 years, especially in the last 5 to 6 years. We've seen a lot of gaijin or foreign, non-Japanese people making anime. And getting their own sort of collaborations off the ground. So essentially, it's what I'm still trying to do today, and I've been taking as long as I have been because I'm essentially in the entertainment industry. I'm a nobody. I'm no one famous as a kid. My mother didn't write Harry Potter. My dad's not some famous actor, so I don't have any real clout behind me. And if I want to be taken seriously for what I want done, then I need to present something as professional as possible. So I've been taking the time to save my resources and build up the strongest pitch possible.
Yeah, great. And then the project's name is Millennium Exile, and we'll go into that. But I want to hark on a couple of things that you mentioned there. And special shout out to Christian Nome for introducing us. He was episode 1 of the third season about Titan Effect, which is a great episode. If you're listening to this and you think, at the end of it, if you like the way that it goes, we don't want to pressure you to go and skip this podcast and go to Christian's, or to make you put like Christian in the next in the queue without actually knowing. But it's a great podcast. You definitely should check it out. One thing you it's amazing just anime in general, and Jack and I are by no means experts in anime, but we can kind of call you an expert in anime because before we started recording, you were telling us about your amazing library right behind you, full of anime. Just what did you say? $90,000 worth of anime.
Last evaluation for house insurance purposes, it's about 90 grand's worth of anime. That's including, all the high-end collectibles that's on this side of it, so not where the camera's seeing. So all you see here is manga, some DVDs and Blu-rays. There's collectibles all up on the shelves up there, and just one cabinet of 3 that are around the room, and then just a whole bunch of different collectibles and stuff. So it all adds up over time. Some of the things are really rare. So, some things have not been in print for a long time as far as the old DVD cases go. But I've been a massive anime fan. Some people call me an expert on the subject. I wouldn't brand myself an expert. I am a very big enthusiast, and it's my biggest passion in life. I think there are other people out there that know a lot more than I do, and I would bow to them and give them the title of an expert. It's definitely a very big passion of mine, and it's my biggest passion in life.
And another thing that's interesting about anime is that it's that one very rare cultural thing made from a specific country that has really it's tapped into something that cross cultures, everyone is just like, this is the thing. There's a lot of interest. It's almost like its own language in terms of everyone. There's one person in every classroom around the world that loves anime. That's true, one person, and there's not even that one person. There's probably like 7 people that just absolutely.
I think the number's a bit higher now.
Yeah, right.
So it's very interesting, and it's actually kind of you're in this part where now it's almost, because it's so well beloved, and it's almost coming off the island itself. It's almost coming out of Japan, and now other people can say, hey, I'm not an expert, but I'm a fucking enthusiast.
Yeah, right.
And I have a fucking story that only can be told through anime,
through this medium. And that's what I was gonna hark on that a little bit, because, like you said, when you started writing Millennium Exile, and I promise folks we'll start getting into the world and everything, but just a little background, right? Like you said, 12 years. Like I was like 12 years. Everything's around like 10, 12 years. Yeah. We're working on this project for so long, and now we're finally starting to feel something, right? The ground is starting to rumble with interest for it. And just all the creators out there, you just got to keep on grinding it, because it seems like that decade mark for whatever reason. Like
Especially when you're like most of the people then the creative or want to be creative aren't, the son of J.K. Rowling's.
Will Smith's
nephew,
a
Coppola. Like,
there's a Nick Cage reference.
It takes time, and honestly, it's one of those things too where it's like the world you came up with 12 years ago is not the world it is right now, and it continues to build, and it continues to get refined, and it continues to get better and better, and that's really where that's where the lore comes from, because you could be like, hey, this is a great part, but what led up to that, and you can continue to grow it that way. And, most creators, I think, really like the history of how things became to be. They're interested in how things turned out that way. And a lot of times it's like you build yourself a box of saying, I want it to be here, but how did that time period start? So I have to backtrack, and I have to go into mythology and stuff. So I think that time period, the time it takes to create something is actually really important, especially when you're trying to really ground yourself in what this project is, because when you have that history, you could really feel the passion behind it. It's like, oh, wow, this guy went back thousands of years. Right. You know how long that took?
Yeah, right, exactly.
That was probably for me, that was most inspired by the work of Tolkien. So Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and that sort of stuff. I've always been fascinated with those titles and that world, because if you read the books and you watch the movies, that world feels like it's been lived in prior, like thousands of years prior to our hero's adventure in the book and in the tale that's being told in front of you. And you see certain landmarks and you want to know how that was made, or what was this or what was that. Right. And then it's not until you go onto YouTube and then you start finding all these references, and there's always people out there that are experts in that field, and you find out the history, and there is very much a story being told for all these massive landmarks. And I feel like it makes for a more believable world, yes, but it also makes for a more interesting world and an engaging one where you don't have to give the audience all of the answers, but if you give them enough, it allows their imagination to run away with them. So with Millennium Exile, even though our story takes place at a certain period of time on the planet, my lore goes back about 1,000 years roughly. And there's obviously the planet's existed for longer than that, but a lot of the key things that we're seeing within the story at that time, you start uncovering some bits and pieces of lore, and I want that to be because, I want it to feel like this world has been there longer than our main character was born into it. Like this world doesn't revolve around him. The world's laws don't affect him differently because he's our main character. This is legitimately a case of he's a character that lives in that world. The same rules apply to him as everyone else. And even though that he does have abilities that no one else has, so he does get to do things that other people can't. That world itself is almost the main character in the story. And, there's all these smaller characters and these smaller chess pieces moving throughout it. And that's always something that I really wanted to focus on. And it was something that not just Tolkien did, but like even in other animes, Tolkien wasn't an anime, but in actual other anime productions and stuff, the world just seems so vast. And even to make a recent reference, Made in Abyss. Phenomenal anime. It's only a short series, but I believe when I was reading articles about it, where they wanted to make this story, this world, so it's about this big canyon that goes down, and they wanted to make it so rich in lore and history that they actually studied plant life, and each different animator and person on the project, from what I understand, they had a different plant on their desk. And that was because they were studying all these different plant lives, and they were actually using those as references into drawing different kinds of flora and fauna on the various levels. And so it was all rooted within, even though it was this fantasy world, it was all rooted in like sort of a degree of real life. And that made the world feel amazing. You only get to see but a small portion of this world, but your mind races and you start imagining what else is out there. And that's what makes a journey so magical. It's not always the one that the author or the mangaka or the creator is taking you on. Sometimes the biggest journey is the one that yourself you come up with based off the foundations and the stepping stones that the creator gives you.
Yeah. I like it's almost like the world has to be a character, right? It is a character. It's a character but it's the main character, right? Because everything ebbs and flows through that. But let's use that as a segue to talk about Millennium Exile and the world, right? And I'm going to let you go off and ramble on it, and we are going to chime in and talk about the parts that are really interesting to us as non-anime people, but as story lovers.
But storytellers. And another thing about I was trying to think. There's a sense of like when you're creating that world too, it's weird because your audience is very creative and yet it needs an anchor. And I think we talked about anchors on a couple of podcasts, but you need that thing that can ground everyone in this reality. It's like, okay, this, like, even if it's something as weird as gravity exists on this planet, it at least then allows you, it's like, oh, this is my reference point. This is what happens in this world. And now it's like, I think one of the, like Game of Thrones did this really well, where they brought you into this world that was magical, fantasy, dragons, but yet they also kept pointing out that it's like, oh, ice zombies don't exist. It's like everyone else, until they saw them, were like, they didn't exist. And it was like, there's that internal logic that you're like, oh yeah, you know what? It's just, they're making those stories up. Dragons don't exist. It's all made up. And then all of a sudden they actually do exist. But it's that whole thing. It's like you start with logic, and then you can bring them into fantasy. It's like once you have someone like, oh yeah, this is a real world. Then all of a sudden you say, nope, it's not. There's dragons, and you're like, oh my god, dragons are real. You don't think, oh, this is fake. You think dragons are real,
right?
And so that's one of the cool parts about building worlds.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because especially in fantasy worlds, when you're building something based in fantasy, it can be very easy to make the audience feel like anything's possible. but personally, I find a really important sort of yin to that yang is even if you are in a fantasy world where anything's possible, it's important to have laws and boundaries set in that world to make them believable and to anchor them down. So you want the reader or the audience member to feel like, well, this could be a thing. I don't know it's not a thing. This world has dragons, therefore it may have this, but the characters haven't experienced that in their lifetime. They acknowledge it's like just like the dragons in Game of Thrones. They acknowledged it was a part of their history back in the day, where it was like, oh, it was said this castle was melted with dragon fire, and that sort of stuff. And so it's like this myth that exists. Mm-hmm. And you yourself, as the reader, you go, well, no, this could exist in this world. We saw the direwolves in like episode 1. So you think to yourself, okay, well, this could exist, but our characters don't believe it exists. That's because they haven't seen it in so many years, and it's just this urban myth and urban legend. And I think it's important to have that massive world where anything could be, but at the same time, it has to obey certain laws and there's a ceiling on things. There's a ground and a ceiling on certain things, and I think that helps the characters live in that world as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, right. Just kind of like gravity, keeping them on the world. You need those rules and everything. But yeah, so let's talk about. Go ahead, Millennium Exile. We won't keep on talking about the wonders of story worlds and story building.
Okay, so Millennium Exile. For those of you who know anime, then I suppose the quickest way to pitch Millennium Exile would be it's a mixture of Bleach meets Fate Stay Night set in the Final Fantasy world. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically my story is it's a fantasy shonen, so or shonen / seinen. So it's going to be like a battle anime that would be targeted from sort of 15 plus. It centers around a young man by the name of Vincent, who is born with super strength. However, he doesn't know what the super strength means. He's the only person in his little town. It's very Aladdin-esque. At the start of Aladdin, when you first meet Aladdin, he's kind of like this street rat stealing only what he needs and getting by. And you can tell he's a good guy, but he's still being chased by the police, or the equivalent of. Vincent's very much in that same light. He steals what he needs to. He's living in a very sort of poverty-stricken area. And one day he's confronted by a man who's more powerful than himself. And at this point in the story, Vincent's never lost a fight. Because he's a very big fish living in a small pond, no one else has superpowers. No one else has the strength that he has, this fantastical ability that he has. So because of that, he always gets away. The gangs never beat him in a fight. They continue to bring bigger numbers to him, and he'll keep on owning them. He'll keep on doing his thing. And he helps out as many people as he can for the betterment of the lives of people living in the ghettos with him. But then when he meets this young man by the name of Zero, Zero introduces himself and says, "Your power is something that is needed. You don't know what lies beyond the walls of this ghetto, and we need to take you with us." And Vincent, being a bit of a hot-tempered young man, doesn't really take to that quite well, starts a fight and proceeds to get his ass absolutely flogged. Gets his butt kicked up and down the ghettos. And yeah, it's a story about sort of Zero giving him this offer and saying, look, if you ever want to know what true strength is, come with me. And it's all about, like, you as the audience member will follow Vincent through this world that he never knew existed. And you'll come to realize that these powers are but like one of many that exist in our world. And he's something called a Meister, which is something, it's a person that's born with a set of powers that are categorized much like an RPG, where you'd pick your main character and you'd choose like your archer or your lancer or your berserker. It's very much the same sort of thing. So I've got some RPG elements in there. And our main character joins the organization known as Grave, who is an anti-terrorist organization, and they are fighting to put a stop to this shadow syndicate known as Nexus, which is run by a demonic entity of some sorts. The leadership is shrouded in mystery, and they really don't have a handle on it, but all they do know is Nexus has a lot of very, very strong meisters and talented individuals working for them, and they've corrupted different levels of government throughout the world military. And so Graves' whole point is to investigate their goings on and stop them. So for people that aren't really in the anime know, I suppose you'd call it fantasy X-Men, I suppose. I mean, that's a really dumbed down version of it, but fantasy X-Men, there you go. Avatar meets X-Men.
Yeah, no, that's funny.
Yeah, so I think what I really want. Well, let's talk about why there are maesters in this world. Meisters.
You always call them misters.
Misters. Why are there masters in this world? Meisters.
Meisters.
Why are there meisters in this world? Who created them, and what was their purpose?
So and this actually goes into a bit about what we spoke about earlier, where there's a lore and a history to our world prior to our characters coming into it. The existence of meisters goes back to about 1,000 years prior to the start of our story, where there are celestials, which are basically gods scattered throughout the universe. And they are, even though they're gods, they're something of scientists, I suppose. They are responsible for the creation of all life in all of the different pockets of the universe. And they've separated into different little different groups of celestials, and they're in the different pockets of the universe, and they create life on different planets. They observe that life, they see what's what, and if it's if it works or not. If it doesn't work, then they'll seal it away and they'll pretty much wipe it out of existence. Something that you could very much something similar to the dinosaurs. Even though we have like a meteor hit. We've got scientific evidence of a meteor hitting. The reason I've kind of rooted it in a little bit of reality, where the story of Millennium Exile could very well happen in like the same universe that we're living in now, just in a very very, very distant place that we'll never observe ever in our lives. And so it's very much a case of these things are, animals and species are wiped out all the time. They're created, and these celestials will observe the results and keep creating new life. So they create the very first humanoid in their own form. They create their very first humanoid organism, and that is the Elves. So this is where we start taking on a bit of a fantasy, your stereotypically fantasy sort of races. So you got the elves, gnomes, all that sort of stuff. But rather than existing on one planet, instead of existing all on one planet, these different organisms and life forms, they're actually just exist in different pockets of the universe. So your dwarves might exist, but somewhere else in the universe. But for the sake of our story, it's all about the elves. And these elves wanted for nothing. And what happened was eventually they became too powerful too quickly. The Celestials gave them too much. They grew too far, and they became technologically advanced very quickly. They started getting off-world, and they started becoming very twisted and very, very greedy. And the Celestials realized this, and they said, okay, we've created this amazing life form with huge potential, but we've given it way too much. We've spoiled it. So we need to wipe these off, and we'll start again somewhere else with another humanoid race, and we'll play around with those results. And there was this one celestial by the name of Lucifer. So I take on a lot of current day sort of like religious sort of things, and I'm twisting it into a greater fantasy story. And so basically, there's Lucifer turns around and says, "No, these were my creation. You're not wiping them out. I think they have untapped potential that we're yet to see." So he turns against his celestials, and he becomes what's known as the Fallen. He becomes the first Fallen, which is where a celestial turns against its own kind, and he sort of goes mad. Like he goes down onto the world, lives with the elves, and they worship him as a deity. And because of that close contact, the celestials have never revealed themselves to another life form before, least of all anything sentient. So they've never actually seen what happens when a celestial comes in contact with that sort of a thing. And so with Lucifer living amongst them, he got like this sickness in his mind. He became twisted, he became darkened, and he ended up spreading that madness amongst the elves. Long story short, they get off world, they basically start a war with the rest of the universe, and they start infecting and taking over and colonizing and destroying and harvesting planets throughout the universe. And eventually it sets it sets its sights on Rhyna, which is the planet the Millennium Exile focuses around. And a lot of the remaining Celestials in the universe come together, and they have this one last front, and it just happens to be on Rhyna that this happens. And the humans on Rhyna, they're all born with magic abilities, and they've used magic and science to create alchemy. And it's this great tool that they've been utilizing for a while. But when these gods start waging this war on their planet, it's the humans of Rhyna that are absolutely getting the short end of the stick here. Like, they're getting wiped out. They're just the inhabitants of the planet. They're spectating this thing that's been going on for, so many years before they even knew about this stuff. And eventually all these celestial weapons are dropped, where like this, like godly weapons, like god swords and axes, and all these other sort of weird and wonderful weapons start getting dropped, and blood is spilled from these creatures. And so the humans start using that blood and these weapons, through alchemy and magics, they end up infusing those abilities into the bodies of some humans. And from that, these Meister armies rose up. So, for instance, if they find like a godly sword that's been dropped, they found a way to disassemble that. They tried giving swords to the humans, and the humans couldn't wield them. There was some blowback there, so they end up disassembling it and putting it into like an alchemic form, into a chemical form. And they start injecting it into the blood and into the DNA of humans. And they found out that it took way better than just giving them the celestial weapon itself. And they found out this person would be, their strength and their abilities were heightened, but they'd have the ability to summon bladed weapons to their hands. And so that's the Blader class, and so on and so forth throughout these various different classes. And that's pretty much the origin of how the Meisters came to be.
Yeah. Well, I love the whole idea of the Celestials experimenting on different types of, like you said, humanoid or whatever type of life forms on like test planets, right? Like, they're like, you guys are on this planet. Yeah. And that way, if it's totally fucked up, we could just destroy that planet. Yeah. Or we could just seal it off. It's okay. Forget about that planet. We're going to a different one and we're trying something new. And even like all the way down to the fact that, like you have this internal struggle, right? Which, later, as you would find out, Nexus is very much rooted in the Fallen, and then everything else that's going on. The humans are sitting there, they're just trying to survive. We're just like, guys, come on now. We're just trying to live here, and we're trying to protect ourselves as best we can against these deities that we, didn't even know existed. And really, at the time of Millennium Exile, isn't even... becomes very like historical, but like rooted in so much fantasy. You feel like people are just making up stories about what actually happened.
It's the same thing with Game of Thrones and the dragon that melted the castle. It's a similar thing, and so no,
like all the way down to the fact that the Meisters, that they even really exist. Or that people know that they exist, but like you said in one of our conversations, like 1 in 700 people would never have even met one. Right, that's how spread out amongst the world they are, and these
now in the
present time, like they're so spread out. But it is being passed down because of DNA, because they infused it into human DNA. So
and because of that, didn't the Celestials, before they ended the war, they decided to strip humans of being magical.
Right,
because they figured that was just as dangerous as the Elves were.
Right.
Yeah, they saw the creation of the Meisters, and they thought they were surprised in the ingenuity that humans on Rhyna had to take their magics and take science, create alchemy, and then to take what was being fallen from that war and then mixing that together to create the Meister armies. They thought that was a very ingenious way, but what made them concerned was the creation of this thing known as the Wrath. And the Wrath was basically, it was a rogue experiment by one of these great ancients. And an ancient is basically, there's several ancients. There were 7 to 8 different ancients in this world. They're basically the greatest magic users throughout the world. They're kind of the leading authority on magic, and like the greatest wizards, if you would. And one rogue wizard took the blood. It was the blood of Lucifer himself that was spilled on the planet. And he took it and he used that with the alchemic research that he had. and he ended up creating a very symbiotic sort of organism. So very much like a Venom sort of thing out that you'd see in like a Marvel comic, very similar to that, or ironically enough, like a Prototype, if you've played that video game. Ironically enough, that game came out a few years after I created Vincent, and I got a lot of blowback over that, saying, "Oh, you're ripping off Prototype," and I'm like, "No, I have character sheets that predate this project. Goddamn!" But at the end of the day, it's very much like that, where it's like this almost this living organism, and it's like this black goo. And they infused it into the Lord of the melee class. And a Lord is basically the pinnacle of power in each of those classes. And there's only one living at any given time. So there's the Lord of the melee class, Lord of the blader class, Lord of the Goliath class. So they're the absolute pinnacle. And at the time, they were the leaders of these armies. And so the Lord of the Meister class, the Meister class they're not able to summon weapons, but their bodies themselves are weapons. So they're extraordinarily tough. Their abilities, their physical abilities are way beyond what the other classes are. And it's pretty much to supplement the fact that they can't summon a weapon. And so the Lord of the Meister class was used as a guinea pig to house this destructive capability. And they put that inside his body because his body was the toughest one that humanity had to offer. So they put that inside his body, and he was able to summon any weapon that he wanted out of this goo. Like, it would come up through the pores in his skin. It would create swords, shields, gauntlets, armors. He'd create anything so long as he had the physical strength to control it and manipulate it, because it used a great deal of spiritual energy to do that. And the Celestials saw the creation of this wrath, and that is what concerned them, because this thing, if for all intents and purposes, is evil living inside a human body. And they foresaw that even though they wouldn't be around to see this war out, like, the only reason the war ended was because the Celestials chose the path of mutual destruction. They turned around and said, we're going to lose this war. The forces of evil are too great. This planet's going to get wiped out, and it's not going to be the only one. We have to make this the last stand. So in order to seal away the fallen, there's no way to seal away the fallen without sealing themselves away, because essentially they're both the same entity, just a dark and light version of them. So they sealed themselves away, and without any gods in the universe left to moderate life forms that may have been created with too much or too little, they took a look at the humans' ability with alchemy, because all this was possible through the alchemy that they'd possessed and through their natural born ability to have magic. And they said, well, if this is going to be one of the last things we do before we leave, that thing is dangerous. That thing right there, that shouldn't be happening. And they didn't get a chance to seal away the wrath, but they did get a chance to seal away all humans' ability to cast magic from birth. And because of that, they lost their alchemic research as well, their ability to make alchemy. And unfortunately, it was very much on the cards for them to seal the wrath away. But the war was still happening at this point. It's not like they could just put pause on this war and say, hey, guys, we just need to have a quick sidebar. We need to talk about something going on here. It wasn't really the way that it worked out for them. And so they didn't get a chance to seal the wrath away before they had to make that final conclusion and seal themselves away as well as the fallen. And so what we're left with is this war-torn planet with this strange demonic infection spreading throughout all the different flora and fauna there from the different blood that's been spilled of these deities. And you've got a couple of straggler survivors from the Dark Elves and a new race called the Echo, which was where Dark Elf and a Fallen actually had a baby together. So the creator and the creation ended up mating and having a baby. And there's this half-breed thing called an Echo. And so you've got a couple of those left lying around, and they're now stranded on this foreign planet that they tried to take over and tried to kill. And they're outnumbered by far. Like, even though humanity lost a great deal of number in this war, is still millions of them compared to just a couple of them. And even though they're superpowered as they are, they're pretty much going into hiding. And that's where our story kind of takes place 1,000 years after all that.
Yeah, right. Well, what's really interesting too, right? You have like these three great nations on this planet, and just bear with me here as I ramble on, but like even to say that you have these three nations, we only focus on one, and I'm sorry, is it Roku or what was it?
It's the Republic of Ko, the nation of Ko.
Republic of Ko, there we go. Yeah. Right, and so you're only really focused on that. And I was just even thinking while you were talking about how the Celestials seal themselves away, we don't even really know what other experiments were going on in the universe at that time that are now left completely unchecked.
Yeah.
Right. So you have whatever the dwarves or whatever that's maybe another version of the elves that are completely unchecked, that we don't know what's going on outside of this world, which is really crazy. But we also don't know what's going on in these other nations. Right. We only really hear about, the nation that, Vincent's in, which was the one that had these, the seven armies, the seven Meister armies, to essentially defend humankind against this war that they had no purpose in, right? And that's what's really interesting is the fallout of that, right? You mentioned the echo and everything, or the echoes that are there, and this demonic kind of plague that's going around the entire world, that it just kind of fell away, right? And there's so much to be discovered through Millennium Exile, through any other type of stories that come out of this world that explore like what's actually going on everywhere else. Like what's going on these other worlds, and not necessarily that it has to interfere with Vincent's world, like we've said, but like there is this whole other, just unlimited ability to explore everything else. And like you said, a lot of it we didn't really think about, right? But we can start to piece it together as we go on, and as curiosity comes out of the audience of like, hey, wait a minute, maybe they're more interested in the nations. I'm going to assume they're more interested in the nations that they don't know about. But they could go like, hey, what's going on these other planets? And you're like, as the creator going like, I don't know. Let's see what else is going on in these other planets.
And, there's also the other thing too, is like, because you say the Celestials sealed themselves away 1,000 years ago, and now it's 1,000 years later, we all know how countries pop up, empires pop up, they shrink, they change. So the fact that there are three nations, who the hell knows the origins of the three nations? You know what I mean? There's so many different things that can happen. And now it's more modern times because, we saw some of the art. There's like skyscrapers
and stuff, and ghettos.
But we know how much can change in 1,000 years. So, you could be talking, how medieval, classical, you could, people could be saying, the certain people in that time could be claiming to be celestials, and like, we are the people that should rule the world, the Romans and all those people who think they're touched by God, And I think I was talking to you too about how now that the war is over, it's the same thing that happened, using other historical, whenever there's a big war that ends and you have this big army with nothing to do with it, what do? We're soldiers, so what do? We burn things, we take over things, so you have these...
against each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was very much by design. It was by design to reduce it to just Ko, because for a couple of reasons. A, I feel it's better to the audience to know that there's more going on in this world, and like I said earlier, let your imagination run away with it. It's the same reason why when it's revealed to the audience about the creation of different races, when that's eventually revealed to the audience, there will be mention of orcs and goblins and orcs, goblins and dwarves and all that sort of stuff being made on different planets, and they'll never be referenced again in the show or in the story, and that's very much by design because I don't want this story to feel like it's just here. I want this world and this universe to feel like it's organic and vast, like we the audience are just seeing one particular moment in history from what's a very, very big landscape. And the second reason is because it makes more sense as a storyteller for potential business opportunities later on as well. If you want to go out and do, and that's very much something that I have in the works already, where I'm writing for a prequel, where it goes into the history of a particular band of elves, and it covers the history on their planet from their perspective, seeing like they've even though the Dark Elves are very much the villains in Millennium Exile, this prequel that I'm sort of writing on the back end is very much showing it from their perspective, where they're just this society that's come up and they've been given everything, and then all of a sudden these deities just want to eliminate them, and they're like, what the hell? Like, we've done nothing wrong. Are you kidding me? And so
right.
And then one comes down to defend them, and they worship him. And then it's kind of not entirely their fault that a madness spreads and corrupts their mind the way that it has. And it starts showing it from that different perspective, where it's not just like, hopefully, like if this thing ever came to light, if we ever actually got the prequel to Millennium Exile happening, it will bring to light the fact that the bad guys aren't bad guys for the sake of being villains.
Right. That's the biggest thing.
These characters have their own history and their own lore. And to them, they've done nothing wrong. They're doing what to the elves. They're just like, no. If we stay on this planet and we do not get any bigger, then we are eventually going to get wiped out. These deities made us, want to exterminate us. So in order to fight for our right to survive, we need to get bigger and stronger. And unfortunately, that means we're going to have to get off world, and they are going to start taking things forcefully. And they're still in the wrong for the way in which they do things, because it's never right to just go to another world and just start colonizing it and doing whatever. But to them, it's very much an evil necessity. Like it's like a necessity to. They think they're doing the right thing. They're just like, look, we are the closest thing that there is to fighting these gods. So either get on board or get out of the way. Because we're fighting.
Right. Like we're almost here to protect you. It's like we're almost here to protect you.
Yeah, right.
That's right.
Right. That's
right.
And you know what? And that's some of the stuff that just, really I hate when it's evil for evil's sake. Like, I think the biggest pitfall, I mean, there's plenty of pitfalls with Star Wars, but one of the biggest pitfalls was that the dark side is just pure evil. And it's like, and they set it up really well, because if you read into if you listen to what the Jedi is, it's like no compassion, no passion, no anger, no emotions. You can't have personal relationships. It's like, what human would want to do that? And is it really good to not have compassion for people? Is it really good?
Do the benefits outweigh the
It's like,
negative?
is it good not to be passionate, to be passionately invested in something? It's like, well, maybe not in all situations, but if you don't have it like bland, you don't want to be like, no, I can't help you, because that wouldn't be that's just not, no, I can't help you. It's like, I listened to your plea. Your kid is dying, but right in front of me, but I have my orders and I must stick to them because it's the Jedi code. And you're like, it's then Anakin's turn. It makes sense. Like, you could actually make sense of it.
Not like he's just getting angry.
Not like, he's just, of course, those movies are terrible, like most movies. But then also, to your point too, I was reading something recently about the most brilliant line in the first Star Wars it was a podcast, and it was, what's it called? Building a Better Story World with
Steele Philippek.
It's really good, very insightful. But he said one of the best lines in the first one was just the offhanded remark about the Clone Wars, and it's like that one line spawned the prequels, and it also spawned how many different graphic novels, how many animated television show that ran for 12 seasons. Yeah. So, just mentioning those things, just like you were talking about in Tolkien, where like there's this landmark. It's like, look at that landmark, and you just walk away, and you're like, what about that landmark? What the hell is it?
It's freaky.
It's like if you saw, it's like in Millennium Exile, if one of the cities has this huge skull of a celestial still embroidered into one of the mountains, you'd be like, what the hell is that? It's like, oh, that's the celestial that fell a couple thousand years ago. That thing's massive. What the hell?
That's
so
right.
And that
also,
could be a touch.
It helps the characters feel more legitimate in their own right, because
Sure.
I always found that if you give all of my characters have backstories to them, but even if the series doesn't explore every character's backstory, having that backstory and them having that world that they live in, having all of the I's dotted and the T's crossed for that world, The thing that I find so like whenever I talk to people about character design and everything like that, because I have a bit of fun. I teach a few classes here and there about creative writing over here in Australia, but a lot of the times people get, and rightfully so, but they get very, very distracted, very caught up in the character design because it's all about the character, the character, the character. But the thing is, if you don't have that world properly fleshed out, that character's growth is directly limited by the world that they live in. Because, and I also find personally that if you give everyone enough of a backstory, if you give them their own lives that they've come from, and that you give them a real world that they exist in, a world that existed before them, then I find that the writing will actually start taking on this more natural progression. So when things happen, the one thing that really grinds my gears in story is when someone survives or dies or acts out of character simply because it's what the creator wanted to drive the story in a particular direction, but it doesn't make sense to the character and to the world that they live in. And so I've found myself doing this multiple times throughout the story, Millennium Exile, where, and even most recently, when I finished writing the story, when I finished my conclusion, something happens at the end of that conclusion that me, myself, I can actually say, I don't want this to happen. I didn't want it to end the way that it did. But because I've spent so long with these characters and they've almost got they've got their own lives now and they've got this world that they live in, it dictated that it had to go this way.
Right.
And I was very much like, I had a tear brought to my eye by the time I wrote this because I knew this was how it had to end. This was the right way to end it, not necessarily how I wanted it to go, but it was the way that it needed to, because everything that's been told beforehand, the character is going to react this way. I might not want him to react that way. Me, myself, I'm like, no, don't do this. God damn it, don't do this. I made you. But he's going to do it because this is who that character is. He's even though he's a fictional piece of work, he is living his own life because of the story I've given him.
Yeah, exactly. And, that's a really good insight into character, because I feel like because you always know those characters that you just, like, the difference between something you didn't want to happen versus something that shouldn't have happened. And I'll use another Game of Thrones reference because I watched that one, and so when Oberyn gets his head splashed open, I don't know if you've seen that. Did you? It's one of the most famous. That like literally that was a gut punch to me. Like I'm like, that should not have happened. And I was struggling whether or not I hated it because I was terrible, like it was the worst story I've ever heard, or if it was the only way that could have ended. And I was struggling with that. And then I realized that the reason why every time I watch that scene, I can't finish it. I'm like, oh my God, he's about to do it and he does this. And I'm like, this fucking guy, if he would have just done that. But I'm like, he's not that person. He was never that person. He needed to know the truth. And by God, he was going to get that guy to admit it if it killed him. And it did. And he did admit it and it killed him. But then you go into season 6, where the Battle of the Bastards, and you had Jon Snow run out into the middle of the battlefield like an idiot after his brother got killed. And what happened to him? Nothing happened to him. He got saved, and it didn't make sense. And you watch that that battle the first time, and you're like, oh, it's great. No rewatchability after that, because you realize it didn't follow its own internal logic. There should have been some consequence to pay, and there wasn't. He became the king in the next scene. And it's like, that's not Game of Thrones. That's something else. That's a different
100%,
story.
100%. It's one of my biggest, not a criticism, but it's I'm a big fan of Mobile Suit Gundam, which is a very, very historic anime for Japan and the rest of the world. The rest of the world's caught onto it. There's a big hype train behind it. It's a very big movement. There's different series spanning different timelines to watch. But for me personally, I found that the story, like all Gundams, are based around war, and there's a lot of different Gundam series where there are kids thrown into the war, and in those wars, these characters, like so many of the main characters, survive, and they have some of what I would consider, and this is no hate towards Gundam or the Gundam creators whatsoever, so I love them, but it's got some of the biggest cases of what's called plot armor ever, where they survive just because they're the main character. And it disagrees with all the world's logic and reasoning up until that point. But then I started watching what's one of its most recent iterations, which is called Iron-Blooded Orphans. And that just blew my mind because it was, again, kids thrust into war. But this war does not put on the kid gloves when it's playing with them. It's like, no, you're kids, you're in war, you are going to get fucked up. And it is very brutal, and it's hard to watch almost because you fall in love with these characters and you just want the poor little buggers to win. You're like, oh my God, please just give them a break. Give them a break. They just, oh my God. And it gets gut-wrenching towards the back half of season 2 where you just start watching casts just die off. And it's because it was always going to have to happen that way if you didn't want them surrounded in the thickest plot armor known to man. They're kids. It pretty much serves to reason that these kids these kids aren't going to survive this. These kids have no place surviving this. And I won't go into spoilers about who lives or who dies, but it's the same sort of thing that you're talking about where you watch other series, and this is in the same franchise. You go from like Gundam Seed, where like the main character survives God knows how many direct explosions with, like, there's one where he survives an explosion with a fucking open cockpit. His cockpit's wide open, and this thing blows up right in his face. Same with Gundam Wing. There's like a main character just gets blown clear out of his mech, and then he's fine. He's cool. It's like, why?
Yeah, right.
Because he's the character. And don't get me wrong, you're glad he survives because you like the character, but there's that little thing in the back of your head that can't quite turn itself off and go, how did that happen?
Yeah. Right. And, the other thing, too, is that when in one of the one where everyone is dying, what is it, Blood and Orphans?
Iron-Blooded Orphans.
Iron-Blooded Orphans. The thing is that when those kids do survive, it's the end of the show. That's because you broke once you break it, then it's done. I mean, like, if they survive one battle, they should just run away from the war. You know what I mean? Like, they should just say, somehow that shrapnel missed me. I lost an eye. I'm going to take my knapsack or whatever the hell I have, and I'm just going to go the opposite direction because I'm done with this, And so that's right. If you're in a gritty world and you give yourself a miracle, you only have one of those because it's a miracle. If it happens every show, then it's not a miracle. It's just what happens.
No, that's right. It's kind of like the Dragon Ball Z thing. It's like when Goku first dies, you're like, oh shit, Goku died. And then you're like, oh, but the Dragon Balls can bring him back. And now what are we up to? We're on to I think he's got to be dead in a couple of, he's been dead a few times now. And so there's no longer, and don't get me wrong, biggest Dragon Ball Z fan right here. Welcome to my anime room. There's like a whole section. It's like a Kira Toriyama fucking shrine in this thing. So don't get me wrong, all the love in the world. But there's no stakes anymore. You don't actually fear someone dying in Dragon Ball because you know they're going to come back. Especially if they're a fan favorite. If the polls show that they're a fan favorite, they're coming back. 100%, 10 out of 10 times they are coming back. And so you end up progressively caring less and less about the character's death or the stakes, and you just become more enthralled with the hype train that is the next power-up.
Right. It's so amazing, just hearing you guys talk about like character and then the world and everything too, because it's the rules set by the world, right? And what's the logic in the world? Is this something that the character, like most main characters, are going to survive? Or is it literally telling the story, whatever part of this world is that shit's going to happen that you're not going to see coming? Characters are going to die. Characters are going to, act according to their character every single time. Is that what the world is? Is that the precedent in the world? Is that what's happening? And obviously those are always the best. Like I was just thinking about the only miracle that happened in the Peaky Blinders, right? So we're huge Arthur fans. I love Arthur. Yeah. I got the mustache, right? I mean, I'm the older brother, so I'm the Arthur. Yeah. But like when he got garroted and that whole scene, you're just like, I don't think he's gonna make it. Oh, he's dead. Oh, they did a brilliant job. Cinematically, it was brilliant. They showed the same thing that they did for the other brother that died.
Yeah, right.
You know, like they did the whole thing, and you're like, oh my god, he's dead. But then he comes back, right?
Yeah.
And they can't do that again.
No.
If Arthur dies in season 6, which is coming out eventually, he's got to be dead.
Yeah, he has to die.
They can't bring him back.
Right, you get one miracle.
You get one miracle.
Right, I mean, you know.
Yeah. So you'll get that in Millennium Exile. There's one instance that directly comes to mind, and it should be the only instance because I'm the person that created the bloody thing. There's one instance where you think someone's dead and they're not. It is explained. It's not a main character, so it's nothing like they've got plot armor. There is it has effects for the rest of the story. That character not dying and being where they are will actually drive another path throughout the story that you yourself as the audience will start following. That said, look, every season or every few episodes in Millennium Exile, I want the audience to fear the Red Wedding. Like, I want them to have the fear of the Red Wedding in it, where it's like, no one's safe in this show. You can have a pretty good guess that Vincent's going to make it to the end. But outside of that, I want the audience to really not know where the hell I'm taking it.
Yeah.
And that's because there are rules set in this world, and I kill off characters in this story because the story dictates it and because the writing demands it, not because I'm a fan of the character. Like there's one character that I released to fans, and I released this character sheet. I won't say if it's him or a her because the audience will know immediately who I'm talking to. But there was one character sheet that I released, and the fans just erupted online, and they said, if such and such dies, we riot. Because they didn't want this character to ever die. They loved this character the minute I released their sheet. And they are dying. They are 100% dying. Even though I know the fans have said, we do not want this character to die. Please do not kill this character.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, this character dies because this is how it has to happen in this story.
Yeah.
I don't want people being complacent and just being able to turn their brain off while watching this because they know there's no stakes. I want people to feel like they're invested in this world and in this story. And I promise I'll never kill a character for the sake of killing a character.
Right. Exactly.
Every life is precious, even in a fictional world. And you may have your cannon fodder in some aspects where it's like these no-name sort of grunts in the background. But be it villains or good guys, when a character departs from the world, there's going to be a substantial reason for it. And it's going to be unapologetic because at the end of the day, this is war that they're in. They are in war, and my world and the consequences of it are not going to pull any punches just because fucking dragons exist and all this fantasy stuff exists. There's no Dragon Balls in my world. There's no do-overs. So you'll get one in the story where you think a character's gone. You might get a few like cliffhangers where you don't know if they survived something, but there's only one scene where I will actively show someone pretty much biting it. And then there's just that little bit of gray area that I want to leave out in the open where I'm actually going to manipulate the audience into not looking at that gray area so they don't start asking questions as to whether that character's dead. I kind of manipulate the audience and say, this character's dead. And then you'll find out that through that little gray area that hopefully they didn't catch, they're alive and there's a reason for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah. And going back to the Peaky Blinders thing, how it was a miracle, but yet then again, how it wasn't a miracle, partially because of the rules in that world. And one of the rules is that Tommy always has a plan.
Right.
And that was one of his keystone parts of that plan was to convince the big guy that he lost. So that was so it kind of almost made some sense in that capacity.
Right.
But you don't want to do that too often. And like, one of the biggest things to make a fantasy or a fictional world feel real is stakes. And if you cut out the stakes, then it's not. Then it's fake.
Pretty colors moving on a screen.
Yeah, fiction can be real. It doesn't have to be fake, and stakes is the best way to do that.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I wanted to touch real quick on the fact that, you've done this amazing job and you've gotten so much response from basically a worldwide audience that are chomping at the bit to see this made. And it's always fascinating. It's always really exciting for me and for us to hear that the project that the creator that we're talking to is getting into a mode where, once again, 12 years later, right? But it's getting into a mode where it's like, yeah, we're seriously pitching this. Like and I will say this a million times until my face is blue, until eventually Jack and I make something of note, right? The audience is the most important thing. I'll say it after that too. It's the most important thing.
You say so.
If you have an audience that's already kind of curious, like you said, you released a character sheet and they're like, do not kill this person. You're like, sorry. You didn't tell them that. But it's very much like, I'm not listening to you about who to kill. Like, that's not going to happen. Because then all of a sudden nobody dies. And then once again, no stakes. No stakes. Then there's no happy people, and you're just eating a baked potato without any stakes.
The people wouldn't want to watch if there was no stakes, you know? Especially if it's going to be in a limited capacity. I mean, one of the reasons why Dragon Ball Z doesn't kill off its characters is because how long has it been running?
It's been running for a long time.
I mean, there's really no conclusion to it. It's just going to keep happening until people lose interest in it.
Right.
Yeah, well, the Dragon Ball Z pretty much exists like with its main passion existing in the next big power up and the next big villain. Yeah. And those are its driving points. But a lot of Dragon Ball Z's fan base is rooted in nostalgia as well. Grew up with it when they were a kid, and so when a new season or a new movie comes out, we're seeing it, and I'm part of it. I'm like first person through the door to see the Broly movie at the cinema. I'm beating children through that door. I'm like, get out of the fucking way! I'm into that seat. No, you're not. Like it's its own unique story, and it's an amazing world that Akira Toriyama has made. But again, stakes aren't exactly where that story was focusing.
Right. Yeah, no, it's not. It's
but it's all about the next big power up, the next big villain, and how I think Dragon Ball Z's uniqueness is in the fact that it doesn't have a ceiling. Whereas death was the ceiling, you remove that ceiling, and so then it was like, well, you can only die and be revived once. So then they put a new ceiling above that. And then every time they lift the box on that one, it's like, well, if you get permission from the god, you can come back. And then they open up that room. And then I think that's where its writing uniqueness comes from, is that the fact that even though it doesn't feel like it's got stakes, and it probably doesn't, it keeps on opening the next ceiling up, and it removes itself. It removes that ceiling from itself. And I think that's actually where the uniqueness of its journey lies, is that it's like, okay, where's the next ceiling going to be, and how are we going to get past it? And so I think that's what makes it so over the top and so fantastical. And that's why it will have a fan base that will live on for as long as media does, because it does do things differently. You know, God bless its cotton socks. It's bloody entertaining.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, but yeah, so it's absolutely fantastic. I mean, you're not at Dragon Ball Z level, but you're getting to the point where you have some of these more well-known anime voice actors that are like, hey, when this happens, you let us know. Like, we're going to be there. We're going to do it, which is huge, because from an audience standpoint, or just from our standpoint, that gives a project like that means to me that it's got legs, Right. Like if I was an investor or a distributor or whatever, I'd be like, wait, who said what?
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, I know them. Of course I know them. I just had dinner with them. Whatever, right? But you have that kind of clout, that wave behind it. And it's the most important thing. Your pitch deck better have that just like front and center. It's like, hey, audience-wise, we're doing good.
Yeah.
Like, we got people.
In this new world of hyper competitive, everyone needs, content, audience. It's like, it's IP, they want
all IP.
They want, that's the reason why you get crappy remakes and,
America 2.
Let's open up this old world that didn't why is
remaking of video games too?
Why does Fast and Furious have nine movies?
It's not because
it's not because they're
Vin
good.
Diesel's acting. That's for sure.
It's not because they're good movies.
For the same reason, there's multiple versions of the same phones out on the market, because people keep paying for it. Something's only worth than what someone's willing to pay for it. And for as long as people keep buying the new iPhone, another one's going to come out. And for as long as Fast and Furious keeps selling seats, they're going to keep making ones, because there's no blowback from the global audience saying please stop making these.
Right.
But you as an individual can question that and go, why do we have 9 movies about cars? Like, so like, you know, you can
well, I mean, you know, the first two movies were about racing, and now they're stopping global catastrophes.
International spies. Don't get me wrong. Yeah, now they're
right.
Yeah,
you know,
MI6 called.
They're like paramilitary spies. You know, I don't know what they're doing now.
But like, you know, time we'll get Tom Clancy as one of the directors of the next Fast and Furious.
Jeez.
Yeah,
right.
Well, you know, but you know, just going to say is like just because there is IP there, they took it in a completely different direction. You know what I mean? Yeah. And that's just because they know that there's a product there that they can continue to sell. Pay for, yeah. And that's why building an audience for you is so important, because they're looking for original content. I don't think there's any producer on the planet or any real creative producer on the planet that wants to say, you know what, let's produce the next. I want my career to be producing Fast and Furious movies. No, they want to find the next great creator that can find.
That's where the real money is at.
And you know, that's why, you know, and that's why creating the stuff that you're creating right now, building that audience is going to be it's vastly more important than anything else.
Yeah, I've definitely been very, very lucky and very fortunate. So when I started the project, what I mentioned at the start of the podcast, when I started this project, it was definitely not something that was encouraged by my family and friends. No one quite they understood what I was trying to do, but everyone was like, maybe you'll grow out of it. Maybe it's just a phase. You know, everyone wants to create their own something. Everyone wants to, you know, every anime fan wants to make their own anime. And unfortunately, the vast majority fail. And, you know, it's hard to keep climbing that ladder and to sort of get past the next hurdle and the next hurdle. But I was very, very lucky that comparatively to like the Logan Pauls and the KSIs of YouTube and the internet, I'm not even a speck of sand on that beach with my numbers. But the people that I have influenced with my product and with my project are deeply passionate about it. And I know I've got a good product. I know I've got a good story. And like we said throughout the podcast as well, this has been 12 years in the making. So this thing has not just gotten older, it's matured as I have. So as my writing has gotten better, I've injected that into my project. And I've rewritten things that had plot holes previously. Nothing is sacred for the sake of, oh, I made it, so therefore it can never change. Even if someone was to pick up this IP, I have to be willing, as the creator, to step away from certain things that I previously thought were going to stay the same. We may take this to a studio and say, we need to redesign Vincent. Now, Vincent's image to me, I'm very much married to Vincent's visage. It's how Vincent looks. When I say the word Vincent Klein, I know exactly who Vincent looks like.
Right.
But I need to be adaptable and willing to change that for the sake of like a more experienced director coming into it and a more experienced team than myself. So I've got to be willing to make that change. And I've been very, very lucky with the fans around the world and with the people that I've managed to network with and collaborate with me on this project. I do have an all-star lineup filled for the demo reel. The 3 people that I can sort of mention publicly is Carl Heiber, who is most notably known for Ryu from Street Fighter, and Adult Gohan from Dragon Ball Z. He plays Vincent. Ben Diskin, who is Barn from Seven Deadly Sins for the anime fans out there. And Keiji Tang, who's Archer from Fate Stay Night. Now, these 3 guys have a plethora of different video games and animes that they do. For the sake of time, I'm only sort of going over some of the bigger ones that the fans may know them for. But yeah, I've got an all-star lineup that are in the demo reel that want to be a part of this project moving forwards. And while this project started off very much as me just wanting to achieve my own dream, it's very much gotten bigger than myself now, to the point where I opened a Patreon, and that Patreon, when I was releasing content while I was building the demo reel still, that Patreon exploded. People were donating to me more than I thought that, you know, they donated more than you initially expect. And you start realizing these people want to see this. And now it becomes bigger than yourself. You now owe it to the fans to get this thing made. You know, you don't take no for an answer. If Harry Potter could get rejected from like 6 or 7 different publishers before it got picked up. Why the hell would I expect any different from someone like me? Like, I've got to be expecting rejection, but I owe it to myself, and I owe it to the people that have supported me around the world, and I owe it to my fans to stick this out and to make this thing a reality. One way or the other, we're going to get this thing made. And it's all about whatever company is fortunate enough to see that early. It's going to sort of profit from that. If not, then that's fine. I'll just be another Harry Potter where I blow up later. And then, that's absolutely fine. And I'm happy to wait, because when I first started this project 12 years ago, me wouldn't have been taken seriously purely based on my age. I was in my early 20s. No one's taking an early 20-something-year-old that seriously trying to direct and produce an anime. It's not until you get a little bit older and you start growing like a couple of gray hairs here and there that people start taking you seriously. And it's like, oh, you're not a kid anymore. This is a man that wants to be in this industry. Right. If it's something that I stick with for long enough and I keep maturing and I keep growing, and I keep a collaborative mindset and an open mindset to working with others, I don't want to make this thing in Australia. I want to make this in Japan. And I want the very, very talented men and women of the anime industry, of anime studios such as Bones and UFO Table and stuff like that. And I want directors that have made anime to work with me on this thing, because I believe that a good idea can come from anywhere. And that just because I'm down under doesn't mean to say that that my ideas aren't valid enough to be picked up for an anime production. And I really want to break down those borders and boundaries that separate a lot of our world. And I want to make something with a collaborative spirit. And I really want to create this global network of creativity. Well, I don't want to create it. I want to fit into it. I want to be one part where it connects. And I owe it to my fans to see that happen. And I'm very, very lucky for all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Ty, this has been a fantastic conversation. We got deep into the lore. We got deep into just character design and world design and stuff. It was fantastic. We usually end off with you giving us your best pitch for Millennium Exile. Something that a normal, well-versed anime watcher might want to go check out, even down to, a couple of schmoes like us that don't really know anything about anime that might want to be interested in learning more.
Look, if I haven't interested you enough by the time you've gotten to the end of this podcast, then I've clearly not done a good enough job. And there's nothing I'm going to say with a quick pitch that's going to get that across the line. Like I said, Bleach meets Fate Stay Night set in a Final Fantasy world. For those of you not into anime, think of it like Avatar meets X-Men. Yeah, pretty much going to round that off. At the end of the day, I'm trying to break boundaries. I'm trying to write differently. I want the audience to be engaged and thrilled with it. And I think anime is such a unique genre. And watching its popularity explode over the last 5 to 6 years especially, that speaks for itself. Anime is unique and it's blowing up. It was very much a thing where one kid in every classroom knew what anime was and maybe watched it. Right. But now it's gotten to this thing where almost everyone's children is getting into it, to the point where even someone like me, I travel to schools around my country and around my state, and I teach about anime because of my Millennium Exile project. But that's how popular it is the entire classrooms are talking about anime, to the point where these schools have to get these classrooms together and hire someone like me to come in and talk about it. This thing was never in a school curriculum before now. So that's how it speaks for itself. So anime quite literally saved my life growing up. I was a very depressed young man when I was 14, and I had suicidal thoughts to take things in a more serious direction. Anime spoke to me because it was a different kind of storytelling, a different kind of animated storytelling that didn't hold my hand. It wasn't a cat chasing a mouse for 30 minutes. This thing had legs. This thing, this art form and this medium of storytelling is so vast that there are as many different types of anime out there as there are people. And it's no different than movies. You may be an avid comedy fan or an avid rom-com fan. Guess what? Those exist out there in the anime. Don't limit yourself to just knowing that Dragon Ball Z exists and Sailor Moon exists and assuming that that's all that anime has to offer. Because I promise you, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
And
exactly.
You mentioned something earlier, and I didn't quite bring it up. But now, is there a lot of anime, or are there animes that have bridged that kind of fantasy, like dwarves, elves, ogres, and anime? Has that bridge been gapped? Has that gap been bridged?
There you go. That would be the way to say that.
I'm definitely not the leading authority on every anime that's ever been made, so I haven't seen everything that's ever been made, but there's a lot of fantasy anime out there that do take place in it. One of the most notable genres is called Isekai, which is basically when a character dies and goes to a fantasy land, or they'll plug themselves into a VR headset and get taken into an MMO where everything's real. And that's usually how the audience is brought into a fantasy world, through isekais most recently. Personally, I think the medium is pretty much oversaturated, and I think people are sick of them. I think there's nothing wrong with setting our story in a fantasy world. I don't think the audience isn't stupid. They don't need to know, oh, this character died in our world and now they're over here. Like, I think you could totally start a story in a fantasy land where people are just born into that world. And so, it's definitely been done before. Fantasy is nothing new in storytelling, it's been in anime.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Okay. I was just trying to see, because it seemed like your experience and your love for Tolkien seemed to be streaming into your love for anime, and I don't know if that was something that was unique. And maybe it's not. Maybe that's a little bit naive to think that would be so unique, because
first ever to think about.
Yeah, right. It's not like Japan. It's not like Japan doesn't know about England.
No, I would be so brave as to say that I would be one of the few that goes to it to the extent that I do. I think a lot of stories will go as far as what's going to make the series profitable and get a production. I would go so far as to say that mine is the amount of lore that my story goes into is unique in that aspect. I think I think it would be up there with one of the greats if we got a production with the right budget, with the right team. I think it would be up there with the likes, and don't get me wrong, please, no hate over here from the anime fans watching, but I think that the product that I've made would contend with the greats like Full Metal Alchemist and and the Fate Stay Nights and like the Evangelions. I think what I've created is something unique. I think it is something that we've fleshed out a lot, and I believe it could be one of the big staples, but there's a lot of work that needs to go in between then and now. A lot
of work. Yeah. Right. Well, we're rooting for you. Yeah. I told this to Christian, I told this to Matt and Jake, the other two people that we had on the podcast. You have us at your disposal. Yeah, right. Christian has been sending me his pitch deck, and I fucking love looking at it and just boop, boop, boop. Hey, why not try this? Hey, why not try this? So you have us at your disposal for
stuff in that. It's insane how much he's got in that. It's really inspiring.
Yeah. So like I said, you have us at your disposal. Looking forward to meeting you in person. At some point, we'll end up in Australia, but really, we got to get you out of Australia because you haven't been outside of Australia. Yeah, right. So maybe we'll meet up in Japan. That'll be.
Well, right. Yeah, a neutral setting.
A neutral setting, right? It's great talking to you, Ty. I'm really looking forward to seeing new developments on the projects and talking again soon.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me on.
Well, that was an absolute fantastic conversation. I am so excited. We're not anime guys, but, we might have to become them.
Well, we're definitely storytellers. And
that's true.
Good stories are good stories regardless of what medium you're using.
Right, exactly. So check out some of our other podcast episodes, especially from Season 3 if you like what you heard so far. We have 2 other episodes you can check out. And then Stipulations. If you like cocktail drinks, hey, I got a feeling that the Frosty Knuckler is going to be a new podcast. Thanks for watching, guys.